It's a debate that comes up every so often in Star Trek fan circles, and it's extremely difficult to answer, and it's a conundrum that's been rolling around the internets once again in recent months. In the second season episode of Star Trek Voyager, Tuvix, did Captain Janeway murder the character of Tuvix in order to restore Commander Tuvok and Mr. Neelix? So, let's back up for a moment. Tuvok and Neelix are on a planet, collecting some kind of flowers or something, and due to some kind of quirky transporter malfunction plot device, the two of them are beamed back aboard Voyager as one unified being, a man who is comprised of both Tuvok and Neelix. He possesses the memories and personalities of the two men combined, and yet he is also an entirely new, unique individual. He is a new sentient person, half Vulcan, half Talaxian. So they decide to call him Tuvix, because I suppose it was a better choice than something like Nevok. As the crew tries to figure out how this extraordinary event happened, Tuvix suggests it is symbiogenesis, a merger of two life forms made possible by some enzymes in the orchids they collected on the planet, blah blah. But that's not what's important. Tuvix goes on to spend many days on Voyager, having his very own new, unique experiences and creating new memories, essentially living as a new form of life, as a new person. The crew get to know him, and he develops friendships. But at the end of the episode comes the moral and ethical dilemma. They figure out a way to restore Neelix and Tuvok, so that they can once again exist as two individual people. But obviously doing this will mean that Tuvix will cease to exist. As Tuvix is a unique person, it is tantamount to an execution. So it's essentially murder. Tuvix does not want to die. He is unwilling to sacrifice himself in order to restore Tuvok and Neelix, but Janeway is adamant and orders him to sickbay to undergo the restoration procedure. There's a rather disturbing scene on the bridge where he disobeys her, and he runs around the bridge desperately trying to convince anyone to take his side and support him. But I guess they're all too cowardly to do so, because they just sit there and let Tuvix be led to the slaughterhouse, realizing that he's beaten and that security are just going to drag him off to sickbay one way or the other. He departs, telling them that they will have to live with the consequences of what's about to happen. Essentially, they're all complicit in his execution. Unfortunately, this being Star Trek Voyager, most of the time, events from previous episodes are largely ignored about a week later, so sadly for Tuvix, his extermination is pretty much forgotten. Ouch. The only person on the crew who has any balls to stand up to Janeway is the holographic doctor, who tells her in sickbay that he won't perform the procedure because a physician must do no harm, and he won't take Mr. Tuvix's life against his will. So, Janeway does it anyway. They use the transporter to separate Tuvix back into Neelix and Tuvok. And after this episode, they all just forget that this unfortunate and deeply messed up situation ever took place. Now, there's two schools of thought when it comes to this dilemma. The first is purely practical and academic. It's essentially a kind of trolley problem, where there's a choice to save two lives over one. Tuvok and Neelix are unfortunate victims of a random event, an accident that they had no control over, and that should never have happened. And so someone needs to advocate on their behalf. They have a right to live, and if there is a means by which the merger can be undone, then they can live once again. Mr. Tuvix was never meant to exist. Why should one man now live where previously there were two separate living beings? Surely the majority outweighs the minority, 2 versus 1. The second school of thought is more philosophical. In every conceivable way, Mr. Tuvix qualifies as a sentient humanoid being, and therefore has as much right to exist as either Mr. Neelix or Mr. Tuvok. While their deaths, for lack of a better word, were unfortunate accidents are part and parcel of service in Starfleet. Their demise does not and should not undermine Mr. Tuvix's right to life. He should be treated as a free, sovereign being with rights and liberties of his own, including his right to self-determination. While Tuvok and Neelix are unable to argue for their own right to life, Tuvix is able to argue for his. Now, even though I prefer to have Tuvok and Neelix as two separate people, I'm astounded at the viciousness and ruthlessness of Janeway. She just comes across as extremely aggressive and self-righteous. She expresses zero compassion or empathy for Tuvix. Now, it could be argued that she is behaving this way as an emotional defense mechanism to protect her from reflecting or deliberating on this extremely difficult dilemma any further because it's just too painful. A decision needs to be made. Either Tuvix remains, or he is separated back into Tuvok and Neelix. She wants this situation to end as quick as possible, and she's justified to herself that someone needs to represent the right to life of Tuvok and Neelix, who aren't here to speak for themselves. Regardless, in her mind, she has to make a choice, or so she believes that it is her choice to make. The problem is that it isn't her choice to make. Tuvix may be the result of a transporter accident, but regardless as to whether a new life form is created by accident or intentionally, it still has the same basic rights. And to add a Star Trek element here, they are on a mission to seek out new life. Tuvix is certainly new life. Even though Tuvok and Neelix are unable to advocate for their own lives, that doesn't automatically mean that they would advocate against Mr. Tuvix's right to life. How many enlightened officers of the 24th century would want to put their own life ahead of someone else's? What should have happened here is that Janeway should have declared Tuvok and Neelix lost in the line of duty. In their place is now a new sentient life form, an independent person with rights of their own. As a result, Tuvix has the right to self-determination, and he can choose if he wishes to undergo the restoration procedure or not. If he chooses not to, then Janeway and the crew must accept that. They must accept his choice. This would have resolved the issue, but of course, it was never actually going to happen because Tim Russ and Ethan Phillips are regular cast members, and therefore Tuvok and Neelix had to be restored. But anyway, what bugs me though is the fact that besides the Doctor, not one other crew member sees things from this perspective. Why didn't Chakotay, for example, pull Janeway aside and argue with her about this? He would go on to have other heated disputes with her later in the show about orders that he disagreed with. Why didn't he tell her that what she was doing was wrong? Instead, he just stands there on the bridge, silently, and watches as she has an innocent man put to death. Now, I suppose you could argue that 45 minutes really isn't long enough to truly explore this issue and do it justice. Of course, it wasn't like Tim Russ and Ethan Phillips were ever going to be written out of the show, but there could have been another means of fixing this. Like, for example, Janeway could have given Tuvix the choice of undergoing the restoration procedure, and when he refused, she would have to accept that. She would have to accept that he was going to continue as a member of the crew. But then, some days later, the Doctor could discover that at some cellular level, the merger of Tuvok and Neelix is somehow becoming unstable, it's breaking down, and that they need to be separated or else Tuvix won't live much longer, thus giving Tuvix the chance to sacrifice himself so that Tuvok and Neelix could be restored. Something like that might have worked better, and would have allowed him to bow out in a graceful, noble, and heroic manner, sacrificing himself for them. Also, the crew could then mourn his passing, even holding a funeral for him in the mess hall. And I think this funeral would have been all the more interesting and poignant if both Tuvok and Neelix were in attendance. But ordering and forcing an innocent man to give up his life against his will is just cruel and entirely un-Starfleet. To be blunt, Janeway just comes across as a bit of a cold-blooded psycho in the conclusion of this story. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this dilemma from the episode Tuvix in the comments below, and if you would like to support my work, you can do so via the link to my subscribe star below. It's very much appreciated, and it helps to keep the show going. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.